지금부터 제7회 서울 국제 미디어 아트 비엔날레 국제 학술 심포지움을 개최하겠습니다. 추운 날씨에도 찾아주신 관객 여러분께 깊은 감사를 드립니다. We are very delighted to host the International Symposium. Thank you for coming despite the cold weather. 잠시 통역기 사용에 관해서 안내해드리겠습니다. 통역기의 채널을 선택하여 주시면 통역사의 통역을 들으실 수 있습니다. 1번은 한국어, 2번은 영어입니다. Before we start the symposium, I would like to briefly explain how to use the phonic translator to hear translations in Korean or English. Channel number 1 will be guide you to Korean translations and the number 2 will be in English. 그래서 맞춰주십시오. 그럼 이번 국제학술 심포지움은 내년에 개최될 서울국제 미디어아트 비엔날레 선행연도의 행사로 마련된 것입니다. 국제학술 심포지움도 그렇고 서울국제 미디어아트 비엔날레도 그렇고 어느덧 제7회를 맞이하게 되었습니다. 2000년도에 제1회 미디어아트 비엔날레가 개최된 이래 준비 연도를 포함하여 벌써 14년째 미디어아트 비엔날레가 지속되어 오고 있습니다. 수도 서울을 대표하는 비엔날레로 성장해온 우리 서울국제 미디어 아트 비엔날레가 내년 제7회를 비롯하여 앞으로도 계속해서 발전해 나가기를 기대하며 오늘 심포지움의 진행 순서를 간단히 말씀드리겠습니다. 먼저 유희영 서울시립미술 관장님의 인사 말씀이 있으실 겁니다. 그리고 다음으로 오늘 심포지움의 주제인 New Media Art 새로운 이슈와 상황들을 가지고 발표와 토론이 이어지겠습니다. 5분 발제자의 발표가 진행되는 동안에 중간에 약 20분간 휴식이 있겠고요. 그리고 발제자의 발표가 모두 끝난 후 약 10분간 휴식 시간을 가지고 곧이어서 질의 종합 토론으로 들어가겠습니다. 그럼 여러분 유희영 서울시립미술관 관장님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 박수로 맞이해 주십시오.
그런데도 불구하고 이처럼 많이 와주신 여러분께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 마침 아직 대학은 종강이 안 됐기 때문에 여러 가지 강의, 여러 가지 수업에도 그것까지 처음 와주신 우리 학생, 대학생 여러분에게 감사드립니다. 이제 사회자께서 말씀한 것처럼 내년에 9월이면 우리가 제7회 서울 국제 미디어 비엔날레가 개최됩니다. 알겠습니다만 2002년도에 처음 시작한 이 비엔날레는 이제 세계 어느 곳이든지 이제 알려진 비엔날레가 되기 때문에 굳이 비엔날레 성격과 방향에 대해서 말씀 안 드려도 충분히 아시기 때문에 앞으로 여러분들이 이제 우리 비엔날레의 오프닝 때는 관심 있게 지켜봐 주시기 바랍니다. 아시겠지만 한국은 이제 IT 강국의 종주국으로서 미디어 비엔날레가 이제 정착되어 가고 있습니다. 다만 한 가지는 국제적인 홍보 면에서는 약간 우리가 광주 비엔날레에 비해서 조금 떨어진 감이 없지 않아 있습니다만 작품의 내용과 방향 그리고 좋은 큐레이터들이 와서 우리 한국에서 우리 한국의 비엔날레를 갖다가 관심 있게 봐주고 또 작년 같은 경우는 24개 국가에서 약 40~50명의 젊은 작가들이 와서 전수했기 때문에 이제 명실공히 국제적인 비엔날레에 자리를 정착해 나가는 그런 시점에 와 있습니다. 그런 면에서 매우 관장으로서 뿐만 아니라 한국의 미술인으로서 자부심을 느끼게 합니다. 오늘 사계국에서 4분의 큐레이터들이 와 계십니다. 그 밖에 또 담론과 그리고 토론을 해주신 분들 많이 와 계십니다만 아무튼 오늘 시간이 유익하고 또 내년에 있을 비엔날레에 많은 원동력이 될 수 있도록 여러분들이 지원해 주시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다.
네, 관장님 인사말 감사드립니다. 그러면 지금부터 간단하게 오늘 심포지움에 오신 그 발제자들을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 발제자들은 호명을 하면 자리에서 일어서서 관객을 향해서 인사를 해 주실 겁니다. 그러면 우리는 박수로 그분들을 맞이해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 먼저 제7회 서울국제 미디어 아트 비엔날레 총감독이신 유진상 교수님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 유진상 교수님은 미디아트를 포함한 현대 미술 전시 기획과 비평 강연을 꾸준히 활동하고 그 분야에서 꾸준히 활동하고 계시고요. 그 다음에 여러분이 좀 잘 아시는 덕수궁 미술관에서 얼마 전에 있었던 추상하라라는 전시 그리고 제1회 아시아프 총감독으로 그 전시를 기획하고 활동하시는 것으로 잘 알려져 있습니다. 그리고 중앙미술대전 심사위원장 및 광주 비엔날레 평가위원 등을 역임한 바 있습니다. 오늘은 그림자의 중심이라는 제목으로 발제를 해주시겠습니다. 그러면 다음 연사로 소개를 드리겠습니다. 마크 그레드 소개시켜 드리겠습니다. 일어서 주십시오. 마크 그레드 씨는 큐레이터이자 미술평론가로 베를린 자유대학에서 영화 이론으로 박사학위를 받은 바 있습니다. 2007년 뭄바이와 벵갈로르에서 개최된 Experimental Festival의 큐레이터로 초청된 바 있습니다. 그리고 벨기에의 크로케에서 열린 Still Moving Still: The History of Slide Projection in the Arts라는 전시를 기획한 바 있습니다. 그리고 2008년부터는 바젤 아트페어에서 영화 프로그램 큐레이터로 활동 중이시며 팬텀이나 아트 인 아메리카나, 엑스트라 같은 매거진에 정기적으로 기고를 하고 계십니다. 그리고 이분은 지금 독일 베를린에서 거주하며 활동하고 계시고 오늘은 자아의 재정립, 공간 지각, 이미지 간의 역학관계에 관한 언급이란 주제로 발제해 주시겠습니다. 다음으로는 유키코 시타카 씨를 소개해 드리겠습니다. 유키코 시가타 씨는 도쿄에 거주하며 미디어아트 큐레이터 및 비평가로 활동 중입니다. 도쿄 조용대학 및 타마미술대학 초빙 교수이시면서 이야마스에서 강사를 영입한 바 있습니다. 그래서 캐논 아트랩, 모리 미술관, NTT, ICC 등에서 다양한 프로젝트와 전시를 기획했고 최근 프로젝트로는 미션 G Sensing the Earth 라는 전시하고 그 다음에 인천 인다프에서 같이 공동 기획한 Senses 라는 전시가 있습니다. 그리고 지금은 아르트 일렉트로니카 프라이즈나 유네스코 디지털 아트 프라이즈나 유럽의 백남준 어워드나 일본 미디어 아트 페스티벌의 심사위원으로도 활동하고 계십니다. 오늘은 3.11 이후 예술, 삶, 과학 및 사회통합을 시도하는 신대중을 위하여 라는 주제로 발제를 해주시겠습니다. 그 다음은 올로프 반 빈든 씨를 소개해드리겠습니다. 올로프 반 빈든 씨는 네덜란드 출생으로 실험적인 미디어 아트 분야와 퍼포밍 아트 그리고 비주얼 아트 분야에서 다채로운 활동을 지금 전개하고 계시며 현재는 Today's Art Festival과 노틀담 대학의 예술문화학과와 몬드리안 재단에서 활동하고 계십니다. 오늘은 비주얼 미디어에서 소셜 미디어로 라는 제목하에 발제를 해주시겠습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 우리 루스 베인 씨를 소개해드리겠습니다. 루스 베인 씨는 공공기관과 상업갤러리에 종사하면서 200차례가 넘는 개인전을 기획하셨고 호주 전역에서 여러 차례 공공예술 커미션을 진행하는 등 예술 분야에서 강대한 경력을 가지고 계십니다. 그래서 현재는 엑스페리멘탈 미디어 아트센터의 액팅 디렉터로 활동하고 계시고요. 그리고 모네시 대학 교수로 재직 중이십니다. 그리고 오늘은 엑스페리멘탈 새로운 예술과 새로운 관객이라는 주제로 발제를 해주시겠습니다. 그러면 지금부터 첫 번째 연사로 유진상 감독님을 모시고 첫 번째 발제를 시작하도록 해보겠습니다. 읽어주시면 감사하겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 먼저 이 심포지움에 많이 참석을 해주셔서 감사드리고요. 이 그 심포지움이 사실은 그동안 우리가 궁금하게 생각했던 뉴 미디어 아트에 대한 여러 가지 지식들과 정보들을 전달할 수 있는 그런 자리이자 앞으로 내년에 열리게 될 뉴 미디어 미디어 시티 서울 전시의 어떤 방향성을 갖다가 제시할 수 있는 그런 귀한 자리가 되었으면 하는 바람입니다. 자, 먼저 저는 오늘 처음에 시작되는 발제 내용으로서 그림자의 중심이라고 하는 내용으로 자료를 발제 내용을 준비를 했습니다. 잠깐만, 이걸 준비했습니다. 제목은 센터 오브 더 섀도우라고 했는데 사실은 제가 이 제목을 정한 이유는 듀샹의 캐스팅 섀도우라고 하는 텍스트에서 텍스트를 읽다가 떠올린 제목이고요. 또 다른 한편으로는 이 섀도우라고 하는 것이 오늘날 뉴미디어 아트에 대해서 우리가 갖고 있는 어떤 모호함, 어떤 새로움에 대한 동경, 또 한편으로는 뉴미디어 아트가 어떤 방향으로 전개될 것인지에 대한 궁금증, 이런 것들이 마치 흐릿한 어떤 윤곽을 가진 형체를 잘 알 수 없는 그런 몸체인 것처럼 느껴지기 때문에 섀도우라고 하는 단어를 떠올렸다고 생각합니다. 실은 저희가 미디어 시티를 시작하게 되면서 2000년에 이제 첫 1회를 열었을 때 많은 분들이 가졌던 관심 가운데 하나는 뭐냐면 IT, 한국에서 산업의 어떤 중요한 부분으로 떠오르는 인포메이션 테크놀로지, 그 다음에 프로덕션 디자인, 그 다음에 이제 문화 콘텐츠라고 하는 그런 부분과 그다음에 라이프 스타일, 이걸 어떤 식으로 하나의 통합된 그림으로 머릿속에 떠올릴 것인가, 그리고 그 예들을 어디서 구할 것인가 하는 그런 궁금증으로부터 시작했다라고 생각을 합니다. 바로 이제 그런 점들 때문에 이 뉴 미디어 아트가 굉장히 중요한 그런 필드로 받아들여졌고, 이제 10년이 지난 지금 저희가 돌아봤을 때 과연 뉴 미디어 아트가 그런 궁금증들을 많이 해소를 했는지, 아니면 여전히 많은 그런 궁금증들이 남아 있는지, 이제 이런 입장에 이제 처해 있는 것이죠. 그래서 사실 저는 이제 이번에 오시는 분들한테도, 스피커들한테도 다음에 세 가지 질문을 이제 드렸습니다. 뉴 미디어 아트가 어떤 새로운 기술이나 기술 환경이 많이 바뀌었기 때문에 SNS라든지 아이폰이라든지 이런 어떤 커뮤니티를 베이스로 한 그런 기술들이 많이 발전됐고, 그 다음에 이제 컨템포러리 아트, 동시대 미술이라고 하는 것도 뉴 미디어 아트의 주변에서 굉장히 커다란 그런 중요성을 갖고 성장을 했고, 그렇기 때문에 과연 어떤 상황이 지금 펼쳐지고 있는 것인지. 그다음에 두 번째로는 이제 마세 듀샹이라고 하는 예술가가 레디메이드를 처음으로 선보인 지 100년이 이제 되고 있습니다. 1913년에 이제 첫 번째 레디메이드가 만들어지고 나서 100년이 이제 지나면서 그 사이에 새로운 미술, 다시 말해서 뉴 아트라고 하는 것은 어떤 식으로 우리한테 받아들여지고 있는지, 이것도 이제 궁금한 부분이었고요. 그 다음에 그래서 큐레이팅이라든지 또는 창작 분야에서 뉴 미디어 아트가 만들어내고 있는 새로운 어떤 활동들, 실천들, 이런 것들은 어떻게 전개되고 있는지, 이런 것들을 한번 이제 여쭤본 것입니다. 사실 이제 저는 개인적으로는 컨템포러리 아트라고 하는 필드에서 글을 써왔고, 뉴 미디어 아트에 대해서 약간 부수적인 그런 활동을 해왔습니다만, 여전히 그 뉴 미디어 아트는 컨템포러리 아트라고 하는 그런 영역과 긴밀한 관계를 가지고 있는 것 같습니다. 제가 이번에 그 발제하신 분들의 그런 글들을 읽어보면서 느낀 점은 뭐냐면은 컨템포러리 아트에 대한 그런 관심이라든가 그 영향력에 대해서 뉴 미디어 아트에서도 새로운 관점들이 형성되고 있다는 것을 느꼈습니다. 제가 이제 사실 오늘 저의 개인적인 그런 관심사로 발제해서 말씀드리려고 하는 거는 결국 아트라고 하는 것이 어떻게 개인대 세계와의 관계 속에서 이런 새로운 예술들을 갖다가 만들어내는가라고 하는 이제 지점입니다. 제가 이제 개인이라고 말씀드리면은 어떤 의미에서는 굉장히 주관적이고 개별적인 그런 주제로 여겨질 수도 있겠습니다만 사실 인디비주얼이라고 하는 것은 저희가 서구에서 발전된 현대 미술, 근대 미술의 어떤 그런 역사 속에서 사실은 예술이라는 것을 갖다가 발전시켜온 어떤 근본적인 동력이라고 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다. 가령 예를 들어 극장이라든가 소설이라든가 악보라든가 이런 것들이 17세기 서구 시민사회에서 발전될 당시에는 시민이라고 하는 계급이 생겨나면서 개인의 어떤 이런 문화 향유라고 하는 것, 그다음에 개인의 어떤 자기 성취, 어떤 개인의 삶의 어떤 완성이라고 하는 것이 점점 더 중요한 그런 역할을 띠게 되고 의미를 띠게 되고 예술에 있어서는 19세기의 가령부터 보들레르의 현대인이라는 모던맨이라고 하는 그런 개념이라든지 아니면 오늘날 많은 그런 테크놀로지 환경에서 사람들이 느끼고 있는 개인적인 영역, 사적 영역이라고 하는 것의 발전으로 이어지는 그런 맥락들을 우리가 살펴보게 됩니다. 결국은 자신의 어떤 그런 바램, 자신의 꿈을 실현시키기 위해서 예술가들이 노력하는 가운데 예술이라고 하는 것이 발전되어 왔다고 볼 수도 있겠고 또 개인과 세계와의 관계가 이 예술에 있어서 굉장히 중요한 어떤 창조적 동력이라고 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다. 듀샹이 첫 번째로 레디메이드를 만들었을 때 저는 사실은 얼마나 상황이 불안정했을까라는 것을 이제 떠올리게 됩니다. 다시 말해서 새로운 형식의 언어, 종류의 어떤 그런 기술, 새로운 공산품들, 시민사회가 변화하는 그런 시점, 그 다음에 제1차 세계대전이 일어나기 바로 전해에 이 레디메이드가 출발을 하면서 예술이라고 하는 것에 어떤 커다란 패러다임의 변화가 일어났는데 불과 이제 지금으로부터 100년 전이죠. 이 당시에 비평가나 관객들 또는 예술가들이 얼마나 복잡한 생각을 갖게 되었을까라는 생각을 합니다. 사실은 뉴 아트라고 하는 개념은 이런 경험으로부터 출발하는 거라고도 생각이 드는 것이죠. 동시에 듀샹이 1915년에서 23년 사이에 만들었던 이 라즈그레스라고 하는 작품에는 큰 유리라고 하는 이 작품에는 개인에 대한 어떤 뭐라고 할까 비유적인 그런 의미들이 담겨 있습니다. 다시 말해서 이 신부의 자신의 구원자들에 의해 발가벗겨진 신부라고 하는 이 제목은 원래 프랑스어로 번역을 하게 되면 이 세계가 신부가 나만 사랑한다고 하는 굉장히 심지어 조지 버클리의 이상주의적 주관주의를 떠올리는 그런 스테이트먼트로 이루어져 있는 작품입니다. 그래서 이 작품을 보면서 과연 20세기 초에 마르셀 듀샹과 같은 작가가 나타나서 한 개인이 세계와 자신의 관계를 정립하는 그런 관계 과정에서 새로운 기술, 새로운 공산품들, 레디메이드, 그다음에 표현 방식, 어떤 그런 커뮤니티와의 관계 이런 것들을 새롭게 만들어 나가는 그 역사가 이후에 많은 실험 예술과 컨템퍼러리 아트에 그 하나의 그 결정적인 영향을 줬다라고 하는 걸 떠올린다면 앞으로 우리가 예술에 대해서 그 예측할 수 있는 어떤 예상할 수 있는 그런 어떤 변화들이 어떻게 다가올 것인가라는 것도 한번 상상해 볼 수 있지 않을까 이렇게 생각을 합니다. 백남주는 그로부터 50년 후에 1963년에 독일에서 그 자신의 어떤 그런 그 세계관을 작품으로 번역하는 이런 일대 그 퍼포먼스를 벌이게 되는데요. 개인이 그 음악을 전공했던 한 예술가가 음악이라고 하는 것을 전체적으로 새롭게 바라보게 되는 그런 어떤 순간이 있었던 것이죠. 바이올린을 끌고 다닌다고 하는 그런 행위 속에서 어떤 주어진 세계가 이렇게 이렇게 강요한 어떤 그 관습적으로 부여한 어떤 그런 관계를 마치 처음부터 다시 바라보는 그런 시선으로 생각하고 그것을 새롭게 자기가 할 수 있는 그런 범위 내에서 바꿔나가는 그런 그 사건이 벌어지게 됩니다. 그래서 63년도에 음악의 전시, 일렉트로닉 텔레비전이라고 하는 음악의 노출이라고도 번역할 수 있겠죠. 이 전시에서 백남준이 굉장히 중요한 그런 그 음악에 대한 변형을 가하게 되는데요. 이 변형이 프리페어드 피아노, 준비된 피아노라고 하는 작품으로 나타나게 됩니다. 한 개인이 자기한테 주어진 세계를 굉장히 그 새로운 눈으로 바라본다고 하는 것이 과연 왜 예술에서 그렇게 중요한 것이었을까 하는 궁금증을 갖게 되는 것이고요. 그로부터 이 비디오라고 하는 장치로 넘어가면서 그러한 그 음악과의 관계는 본격적으로 자신한테 주어진 것들과 자신과의 관계라고 하는 그런 문제들로 훨씬 더 폭넓게 다루어지게 되었습니다. 64년도에 시작된 그 참여 TV, 파티스페이션 TV라고 하는 것은 거의 최초로 이 TV를 일종의 인터랙티브의 도구로 바라봤던 작품이고요. 그 다음에 로봇이라고 하는 것도 역시 마찬가지고 작품이 실제로 그 관객들 또는 행인들과 함께 길을 걸어갔던 그런 퍼포먼스를 통해서 보여줬던 그런 작품이죠. 얼마 못 가서 이제 넘어지고 망가지긴 했지만 기술자, 일본인 아베 슈오라고 하는 그 기술 테크니션과 백남준이 함께 만든 이 로봇을 통해서 이제 테크놀로지와 아트의 어떤 통솔에 대한 신호가 이제 시작이 됐습니다. 굉장히 독특한 그런 세계에 대한 또는 이런 어떤 종교라든지 어떤 정신적인 문화에 대한 그런 시각 같은 것들이 작품 속에서 드러났고요. 본격적으로 이제 73년에 글로벌 그루브에서 이 세계 전체를 하나의 채널 안에 집어넣는 그런 작품을 이제 만들게 됩니다. 저는 한 가지 궁금하게 생각하는 게 왜 이 세계의 전체라고 하는 것, 어떤 그 세계의 리미트라고 하는 것에 대해서 백남준이 그토록 관심을 가졌을까 하는 이제 생각을 하게 됩니다. 그러니까 미술사적인 어떤 그런 맥락에서보다도 한 개인이 살아가면서 자신이 어떤 태어난 세계와 자신이 살고 있는 세계와 자신과의 관계에 대해서 끊임없이 어떤 뭐라고 할까요? 관계를 재정립해나가는 그런 모습이 이제 보이게 되는 것이죠. 굿모닝 미스터 조조엘은 1983년 1월에 전 세계에서 위성방송으로 진행이 됐던 퍼포먼스입니다. 이 퍼포먼스에서 이제 여러 아티스트들이 참여해서 공동으로 작업을 하게 되는데요. 무대가 지구였던 것이죠. 그래서 글로브라고 하는 것이 작품의 어떤 매체로 등장하게 된다고 되었다고 생각합니다. 86년에 이제 두 번째로 같은 프로젝트가 진행이 되었고 88년에는 아예 노골적으로 제목에서 세계를 뒤덮는다라고 하는 Wrap Around the World라고 하는 작업을 했습니다. 이 세계라고 하는 이 세계라고 하는 주제는 사실은 예술가들한테는 굉장히 익숙한 주제이기도 하면서 궁극적인 주제이고 세계와 자신의 관계가 어떻게 정립되는가가 굉장히 핵심적인 문제가 될 텐데 개인이 그걸 할 수 있다라고 생각하지 않게 되겠죠. 굉장히 황당하면서 상상에 불과한 일이라고 생각을 합니다. 그렇지만 어떤 작가들은 바로 그 문제에 직접 뛰어들게 되는 것이죠. 그래서 자신들을 둘러싸고 있는 세계의 어떤 그런 새로운 어떤 조건들을 아무 편견 없이 바로바로 사용하게 되는 것입니다. 마지막 백남준의 작품은 이제 레이저라고 하는 것인데 저는 이 레이저에 대해서 왜 이렇게 작가가 관심을 보였을까라는 생각을 하게 됩니다. 근데 레이저는 사실은 굉장히 멀리 나가는 일종의 뭐라고 할까요? 기록 장치라고도 할 수 있고 표시 장치라고도 할 수 있는데 지구를 벗어나서 거의 우주 공간에다가 말하자면 일종의 신호를 보낼 수 있는 그런 거의 유일한 채널이기도 하죠. 이런 생각들이 1963년에 시작이 됐습니다. 오늘의 기술 환경을 보면서 저는 이런 작가들이 어떤 생각을 하게 될지 이제 궁금해지는 것이죠. 물론 이제 굉장히 다양한 그런 뉴미디어의 그런 분야들이 있습니다. 여기 제시된 것만으로 거의 20가지가 넘는 그런 형태의 그런 예술적 표현들이 있는 것이고요. 디터 다니엘스는 이번 심포지움 자료의 맨 뒷부분에 글을 기고를 해주셨습니다. 직접 와서 발제는 못하시지만 기고를 통해서 그분이 그동안에 한 30-40년 동안 일어났던 뉴미디어 아트의 어떤 발전 과정과 세부적인 그런 변화들에 대해서 이제 지적을 해주셨는데요. 맨 마지막에 텍스트의 맨 마지막에 디터 다니엘스가 이런 말씀을 하셨어요. 오늘날 뉴미디어 아트가 일종의 어떤 그런 여러 가지 어려운 이슈들에 봉착해 있음에도 불구하고 가령 예를 들어 기관에서 벌어지고 있는 많은 공공 프로젝트들이 예산 삭감을 통해서 어려움을 겪게 되고 뉴미디어 아트가 말하자면 대중적인 어떤 그런 확산에 아직 이르지 못하고 있고 이런 문제들에 대해서도 이제 얘기를 합니다만 그럼에도 불구하고 이 분야에서 우리가 기대하고 있는 어떤 미래의 발전, 미래라고 하는 것에 대해서 언급을 하셨어요. 저는 개인적으로 미래라고 하는 것은 사실 컨템포러리 아트에서 별로 다뤄지지 않는 주제라고 생각을 합니다. 미래가 어떻게 우리한테 구체적으로 드러날지에 대해서 막연한 생각만을 가지고 있다고 느낍니다만 저는 이제 최근에 리처 카쿠라고 하는 사람이 쓴 Physics of the Future라는 책을 읽으면서 물론 굉장히 대중적인 책입니다만 이런 소위 말해서 현재 진행되고 있는 기술들이 앞으로 우리를 어떻게 생활이나 또는 일상의 습관이라든지 사고방식에서 바꾸어 나갈지에 대한 예시들을 갖다가 보게 되었습니다. 이번에 이제 일본의 스스무 다치라고 하는 사람이 만들고 있는 투명망 또 한 18년 전에 이제 저희가 해외 투표를 통해서 봤던 장치고요. 그다음에 이제 증강현실이라든지 또는 눈에다가 직접 장치하는 모니터, LED로 된 컨택트 렌즈죠. 인터넷에 연결되어 있는 그런 표시 장치입니다. 이런 것들이 우리한테 어떤 영향을 주게 될지 이런 거에 대해서 이제 얘기를 해야 된다고 생각합니다. 지금 우리가 아이폰을 이용해서 다루고 있는 이런 증강현실이라든지 또는 모션 센싱이라든지 이런 것들이 저희한테 직접 몸으로 이제 들어와서 구현이 되겠죠. 그래서 우리가 바라보는 것 자체가 보는 것만으로도 지식이 검색이 되고 의사표시가 되는 디스플레이가 되는 이제 그런 그 시대가 될 텐데요. 직접 그 눈과 두뇌의 어떤 그런 인터페이스가 이루어지고 그 다음에 이제 우리가 버추얼 리얼리티라고 불렀던 그런 내용들도 바로 그 가정에서 이제는 좀 더 어포더블하게 이렇게 활용할 수 있게 된 그런 혜택 같은 것들도 원격 전송을 통해서 실제로 멀리 떨어져 있는 그런 사물들을 옆에서 바로 느낄 수 있게 되는 이런 기술들이 만약에 몇 년 안에 5년이나 10년 이내에 우리 곁으로 다가오게 돼서 우리가 그것들을 같이 가지고 생활을 하게 된다고 하면 아마 예술적 그런 표현이나 창작에 대한 문제들도 급격하게 바뀌지 않을까 하는 생각을 합니다. 로봇도 마찬가지가 되겠죠. 우리가 이제 영화에서 봤던 사실들 이런 것들이 그런 그 현실에 한 부분 된다라고 하는 것은 오래전부터 우리가 이야기해왔던 내용입니다. 이거는 이제 요새 한국에 머물고 있는 그 제임스 파우더리를 비시해서 그 소위 말해서 디지털 장치로 그 그래피티를 하는 작가들의 일종의 정치적인 의사표시 또는 공공 커뮤니티 경영에 나가고 있는 어떤 디지털을 이용한 개별적 뭐랄까요 커뮤니케이션의 어떤 그런 사례가 되겠습니다. 이것도 이제 그런 기술들이 실질적으로 그 환자의 몸에 표시장치와 말하자면 그 모션 센싱이 장착이 돼서 그래피티를 원격으로 할 수 있게 해주는 그런 장치인 것이죠. 이걸 친구들이 만들어줬다고 그러는데요. 하이라이터라고 하는 그런 작품입니다. 이런 것들이 아직은 저희가 구체적으로 느끼지 못하지만 이미 우리 곁에 와서 우리의 환경을 갖다가 바꾸게 된다라고 하는 그런 생각을 하게 됩니다. 이거는 이제 그 디샹의 자필 원고들 가운데 캐스트 섀도우스라고 하는 그 텍스트에 나오는 그것이죠. 어떤 빛이 어디선가 이렇게 비춰와서 그것이 우리가 느끼고 있는 어떤 표면에 그려진 어떤 그림을 갖다가 3차원 공간에 프로젝션을 했을 때 그 그림자를 우리가 보면서 원래 그 이미지가 무엇인지 또는 그 빛이 어디서부터 오는 것인지를 이제 추정해야 되는데요. 그런 그 광원 또는 그런 어떤 소스가 어디서부터 출발하는지에 대한 어떤 그런 추측 같은 것들이 말하자면 이제 우리가 지식을 통해서 또는 예술을 통해서 알아내려고 노력하는 것들이 되겠습니다. 그런데 그런 그림자를 보면서 마치 플라톤의 동굴 같은 것이죠. 그림자를 보면서 원래 실체가 무엇인지 추측하는 그런 방법이 너무 어렵고 좀 모호하다고 해서 사실 그걸 안 할 수도 이제 없는 것이겠죠. 그래서 이제 저는 그런 그림자를 보면서 그 그림자의 어떤 채적이나 윤곽이나 면적이나 중심, 지름, 반지름 이런 것들을 갖다가 구해나간다고 생각을 하고 있습니다. 이것은 이제 조르다노 브루노라고 하는 중세 르네상스 초기 르네상스 시기에 과학자죠, 철학자이면서 이제 사제이기도 한 인물입니다. 이 세계가 평행한 세계들이 무한히 펼쳐져 있다라고 하는 이야기를 했다가 화형을 당해서 죽은 이제 인물인데 그분의 책의 처음에 나오는 이야기는 그렇습니다. 이 세계의 경계를 갖다가 가르치는데 신학에서는 만약에 거기에 손가락을 찔렀을 때 그 손가락이 바깥으로 나가 있다면 그 손가락은 어디 있는 것인가에 대해서 이제 질문하는 내용이 나옵니다. 사실은 결국은 예술이라는 것도 또는 과학이라는 것도 그런 질문들로부터 출발을 했고 우리가 오늘날 알아내는 상당히 많은 사실들이 그런 것들에 대해서 대답을 주고 있지만 한편으로는 예술가들도 그런 문제들에 대해서 관심들을 가지고 있습니다. 그래서 그런 일들을 질문하고 그런 문제들에 대해서 어떤 예시들을 만들고 있는 사람들은 사실은 대부분 이제까지는 이제 개인들이었죠. 개개인들이 그런 자신의 어떤 삶의 조건과 존재 조건에 대해서 그렇게 모색하고 탐색하면서 찾아 나왔다고 생각합니다. 그래서 저는 이제 오늘 이 발제를 이렇게 제가 시작하면서 사실은 질문에 해당하는 그런 발제라고 말씀드릴 수가 있겠습니다. 앞으로 발제하실 분들께서 우리가 가지고 있는 어떤 그런 환경이라고 하는 것, 어떤 한계라고 하는 것, 어떤 세계에 대해서 우리가 느끼고 있는 어떤 질문들, 사실 이것은 이제 컨템퍼러리 아트에도 공통적으로 해당되는 질문이고, 뉴미디어 아트도 단순히 어떤 기술의 프레젠테이션이 아니라, 기술의 어떤 제시가 아니라 이런 근본적인 문제들을 갖다가 다루는 그런 분야로 인식될 거라고 생각합니다. 그래서 그런 문제들이 어떻게 공통적으로 이런 기술 기반 미술에서도 다루어질지에 대해서 질문을 던지면서 제가 오늘 첫 번째 발제를 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 유시선 선생님 감사합니다. 그리고 저희는 이제 두 번째 발제자의 발표를 듣겠습니다. 마크 그로드스가 발표해 주시겠습니다. 발표해 주시고요.
Yes. Good day. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you to City Seoul for inviting me. I've been very honored to be here today, and special thanks to Jason Yu, and Jujin for doing all the organization and being so great in organizing. Not fully dark, if it's possible. We're not in a cinema. We need a little, yeah, that's okay. The title of my talk that I want to give today is Repositioning the Self, Some Remarks on the Relation Between Space, Perception and the Image. I'm very happy that some of the topics that I want to address, I think, actually showed up in the speech of Jason Yu. First, some general questions. Over the last 20 years, it has been one of the most prominent arguments that our ways of perception and attention changed intensely through an increasing amount of information and images, speaking of the media. Specifically, the continued growth of digital visual worlds has fostered new thoughts on the impact of data or images and how people deal with it. While this aspect, on one hand, finds interesting resonances already, as we can say, in a shift from the 19th to the 20th century, that's how long it traces back, maybe even longer, the time period that dealt intensely with issues concerning the ways of perception and the period that brought to life the moving image. It has, on the other hand, quite specific in today's dynamics. It is, on the other hand, quite specific in today's dynamics, and of course very different concerning the involved media and intensity. It is hard to compare this irritation that a montage of a film in the 1920s obviously created with the world of music video clips or the stream of internet data today. But it is interesting to acknowledge as well that in this development it is the idea of attention that again has become one important topic in a lot of debates on publications. In a constantly growing and emotionally as well as spatially moving stream of data, it is of high importance to understand where one's attention is actively pointed towards or passively attracted by. Furthermore, and with clear understanding of these two modes of attention, it has actually to be diagnosed that attention has become a key value in our society, almost comparable to money. The density of this stream of images we find in music videos, video games, film, or internet streams has created a reality that continuously sets tasks for our apparatus of perception. It is a mode or feeling of being thrown into a visual particle accelerator. Split screen, multiple sound layers, and multiple text information come along with images, and it is not self-evident that this audio-visual attack, sometimes that is called augmented reality in other fields, can be accurately digested. And it is remarkable that specifically the question of augmented reality, the way of training perception and attentiveness, are key fields of research for the economy, PR companies, science, and most of all, the army. Here's some banal illustrations of that. This is all originating from Terminator, James Cameron, who developed principle ideas about this, how augmented realities should look like. Here, apart from the aspect to make the body functioning better, the efficiency factor, the main interest seemed to be a new economy of attention by embedding additional information into images to maximize the utilization. This tendency does not just result in a continuous exploration of the limitations which the human perception undoubtedly has. It leads as well to new fields of interest concerning the image and its form. Aspects like color, sound, or haptic vibration became discovered potentials for further dynamics. But there should be no doubt about the reason for this interest of industrial and the commercial world. Even if it looks like the new inspiring forms that are often inspired or used by artists in different dynamics, the goal of these forms is to playfully maximize layer of information and in images, and to bend and expand the capacities of decoding this information. This leads to rethinking the image and, as I call it, the haptic dimension. And let me quote Paul Wells in the beginning. The quote, "The era of the post-photographic film has arrived, and while it is clear for the animator, the computer is essentially another pencil, it is also clear that animation and its aesthetics will be affected by the production enhancements afforded by CGI." End quote. So, addressing general questions concerning the digital image or new media usually fall short or have a certain need to generalize or assume in cliches. Nevertheless, I hope I can avoid these dynamics and point out some aspects that I think are worth considering in the debate. It is remarkable to acknowledge, while experience is a heterogeneous field of works, that there seems to be something one could call a ground tone or resonating space, which is a key element in a lot of works dealing with digital aesthetics. It is something that is related to the sleek surface of digital film images, as well as to the glossy surface of 3D scanned sculptures, or even can be found in the smooth color textures of prints or digital images. Here's an excerpt from Matthew Weinstein's latest, one of the latest animations. What is common in all of these works is something that can be called a profound haptical experience, or with a term that Laura Marx has coined, a haptical visuality, quote end. How is this central crossover, this momentum of synesthesia, as I would say, to be understood? Hapticality is per definition a perceptual experience which results from the exploration of objects by touching them. Since most of the new media works are not supposed to be touched or mainly set in the terrain of visual experience, it seems strange to shift towards the haptic sense to describe this profound momentum. I found it interesting when you figured, showed your examples that it was already the technology that tries to, give us an experience like, through technology of the haptic. Well, like maybe we should rethink about the hapticality in the images already. But one needs to see that in recent art history, as well as in media theory, and I quote Cordelia Brown, haptic is a term that has come to articulate the perception of touch through any experimental means. So one may have a haptic experience through vision, sound, taste, etc., without any exclusive use of the touch sense itself. Haptic visuality or viewing detaches the sense of touch in order to focus exclusively on that which is experienced via vision. In other words, one can experience the sensation of touch through vision alone. This application of the term has its basis in art history, but has more recently also been adapted to apply to moving image and cinema theory, or an expansion of that in media. It is specifically in the field of the new aesthetics, or in a field where our perceptive apparatus is struggling and insecure in its way of functioning, that we can see this reactivation of a sensorium. You see an image by artist Olafur Eliasson, who created in Berlin a kind of space that's called the yellow space of yellow light, where he shows us how the perception through the use of this yellow or gray light excludes colors from our everyday perception. So if you enter the room with the yellow light on, you enter a room where basically everything is yellow or grayish, and when the yellow light is turned off, you will see that there are full color circles that are painted. It seems that the more we are losing in these works our everyday strategy to decode and optically see, the more we are reactivating our strategies to perceive. In doing so, we allow our bodies literally to come back to their senses. We begin to touch, smell, and hear again with a new intensity. And by perceiving films, painting, or installations, in this way we have to realize the main agency for this process is our body, or as Merleau-Ponty has put it, quote, "My body is the field within which my perceptive powers are localized," end of quote. In other words, experiencing the sleek surface of digital aesthetics often means to fail in our known ways of approaching our works, but on the other hand offers us to get to know something about our own strategies of visual perception and our body in general. It's important to pronounce this complexity in the bodily dimension, since the almost pristine surface involves us differently. Walter Benjamin has pronounced this connection of the senses and pointed out how intuitively we use this potential, especially in moments of crisis, in his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Technological Reproducibility. He writes, in the beginning of quote, "For the tasks of which face the human apparatus of perception at the turning points of history cannot be solved by optical means, that is, by contemplation alone. They are mastered gradually by habit, under the guidance of tactile appropriation. Reception in a state of distraction, which is increasingly noticeable in all fields of art and is symptomatic of profound changes in appreciation, finds in the film its true means of exercise." Quote end. The task that Benjamin is referring to in the early 1930s is an increasingly growing number of intense moments. He uses the word shock that brings our sensorium to its limits. At this point, our body often can't use its visual strategies alone to deal with the momentum of the crisis. And it is, following Benjamin, often the haptic dimension that offers us way through this difficulty. Here, the visual is no longer the dominating sense and separated from the other senses. On the contrary, we discover the connectedness of our senses, and it becomes necessary to rethink our understanding of them. In a way, the mode of thinking and experiences the world through a divided sensorium shows its restrictions. Furthermore, we have to understand how our senses interact. As we see, hapticality is not only referring to the direct touch of our fingers. We have to acknowledge that our eyes are capable of touching as well. 80 years after Benjamin's essay, it now seems that we have to experience this connectedness of the senses again, yet different. We understand that it is no longer the moving image in general that creates a momentum of shock. It is not even the unbelievable amount of images that we are digesting on an everyday basis. It has more to do with the categorical different quality of images that creates a momentum, a crisis, and shock. The shock of a reappearing sensuality, the shock that our senses are fundamentally connected and that our perception usually is always a multimodal process. It is, for example, the surface of the digital images that works different on the sensual apparatus. With this in mind, we can understand the strolling around of our eyes in the space of the image also means a process of strolling around between the senses. In the framework of this idea, it becomes evident that it is the relation between image and observer that needs to be readdressed. Jonathan Querry has precisely formulated in his highly acclaimed book, Techniques of the Observer, quote, "The rapid development in little more than a decade of a vast array of computerographic techniques is part of a sweeping configuration of relations between an observing subject and modes of representation that effectively nullifies most of the culturally established meanings of the terms observer and representation. The formalization and diffusion of computer-generated imagery heralds a ubiquitous implantation of fabricated visual spaces, radically different from the mimetic capacities of film, photography, and television. Computer-aided design, synthetic holography, flight simulators, computer animation, virtual environment helmets are only a few of the techniques that are relocating vision to a plane severed from a human observer." End of quote. In the light of this, we have to ask ourselves if a classical understanding of perception through segmented fields of isolated senses might be helpful to an understanding of new images. If we have to admit that our visceral perception is more to be understood as multimodal, triggering several senses at the same time, the distribution of the senses might be right for scientific analysis, but is problematic in terms of understanding perception of artworks. Vivian's subject has pointed out, quote, "It becomes literally nonsensical to talk of the senses as if they were isolated from their entailment in an intentional structure or from each other. To speak of them as if they were discrete modes of access to the world rather than differentiated modalities of perceptual access to the world. The senses are different, openings to the world that cooperate as a unified system of access. The lived body does not have senses, it is rather sensible. It is from the first a perceptive body." And so far, the increasing amount of digital images as digital aesthetics and new media arts should be seen as one of the key triggers to reflect on these worlds. This intensification is even more important when we see an increasing criticism against digital aesthetics in general. That, I think, finds its roots in an old Greenbergian distinction between kitsch and avant-garde, and I think it's really important. Instead of acknowledging the dynamics that pop art, postmodernism, and camp developed by blurring this distinction, it seems that specifically the field of digital aesthetics and animated worlds was a form to reinstall the separation between high and low art, in other words, between good and bad. This not only means to fall back into patterns of an old discussion, but it means as well to ignore the amount of forms and reinstall a clichématic way of thinking and ignore existing forms of aesthetics of high impact to society. Instead, we find ourselves thrown into the question, as I think, that J.D. Jarvis subsumed in his essay Towards Digital Aesthetics. He says, quote, "What does digital art look like? Confounding this slippery topic is the chameleon-like ability of digital art to simulate to a very high degree the appearance of many traditional media and genre. In addition, certain common-held beliefs, some of which are in direct opposition to one another, add to the camouflage, hiding from our awareness the actual scope of current digital art. We have to see that this question is not exclusively leading toward the field of the image, but in the same way to objects and spaces. The sleek digital worlds surround us more and more, which requests not a jump back to neoconservative attitudes. On the contrary, it requests an open-mindedness, or even better, a joyful new sensuality towards the image space and space in general. This new sensitivity disrupts the process that Deleuze and Guattari have called territorialization, meaning a process of categorization, regulation, homogenization, and control. Instead, it leads to a kind of nomadism in space. Quote, the nomadic subject, open to unconventional spatial orientations, can make new connections in keeping with the movement of life as it unfolds. New digital media work shows us the continuous fragility of our spatial orientations, and instead of driving us back into systems of control, they encourage us to walk trustful into a great wide open. Third part, rethinking space. That's the final part. Against the background of this development, various questions concerning how we deal and relate to images or visual data in and with space are at stake. Questions like, how do we create a new way of orientation? How do we relate to an idea of images? How do we alternatively use them? Or how can we reflect our own modes of functioning through and with images data in a constantly changing and increasing image-based environment? These questions have been crucial not just to a commercial development, but generally are at stake, as we can see in recent theoretical debates, like the discussion of the so-called pictorial turn. Especially artists that work with video and film installations have consequently been addressing on this kind of questions. This is because apart from unveiling the new status of the image and the importance of new source attention, they are majorly confronted with another question and can't overlook another force in this discourse that has huge impact on our ways of thinking with and about images. And that force is space. What seems self-evident and almost not worth mentioning has a complex backside. The complexity of the relation between moving image and space becomes clear when you walk through any film or video installation in any kind of museum, which has been quite popular over the last 20 years, I think. There's the aspect of the space being presented in an image, the space of the cadrage, the space of the projection, and furthermore the architectural space of the projection and its relation to concepts like interior, exterior, or public and private. As orient as in 1982, in his essay on the question of other spaces, Michel Foucault remarked on the trend whereby the topos of space had become one of the fundamental thought categories, and the present moment was increasingly determining philosophical and aesthetic discourse. Since then, the amount of discussions which were surrounding the category of space and its impact on images had constantly increased. One of the negative side effects of National, for instance, questioning like the mapping of cities, the naked city, Alan Capro's yard installation, like questioning the gallery space, as well as Carl Andre's way of dealing with the object in, like what is the sculpture in space, or like the flight of the land artists into the country, Walter and Maria's Lightning Field, or Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. Other social compounds or like aspects were addressed. Grandmother Clark's opening the food restaurant, or like buying micro properties in the city of New York, like by 1 meter, for instance. Or Hans Hake's active installment of like a hall that he held in the MoMA. Questions of space came into view that focused on the form inherent to the artwork, as did questions that emphasized the reference to the site of presentation. In 1967, Robert Smithson, for example, addressed the question of the architectural organizing structure of the museum, and went on to discuss the fundamental question, what is a museum, with Alan Capro. These critical approaches, according to which the museum in its form is more of a grave than a structure conducive to a discourse of space, would be expanded in the course of the 1970s and 80s, particularly with regard to social and political processes by artists such as Hans Sake, Marcel Broadhouse, Daniel Green, Michael Asher, Greg Wardowitz, and Andrea Fraser. And I think that is something that can be said at this very moment as well, in terms of like the relevance of museums, art in general, and society issues. While aspects such as processes of free market economies and group dynamics entered the foreground, the question of the concrete spatial conditions of the museum as apparatus, to a certain extent fell from view. However, particularly in connection with the sharply increasing presence since the 1990s of films, videos, and film installations, the museum's topic of space would go on to demand renewed attention. While cinema had been subject to an apparatus analysis from the side of experimental film and film criticism, precisely because of its architectural standards and the perception of film that they directed, it seemed to the experimental film positions that an entirely new spatial freedom was being offered in that other space, the museums. Some expanded ideas here from Charles Ray Eames, kind of like glimpses of the USA that they made for the Moscow exhibition, World exhibition, and the proto cinema by Jeffrey Shaw here to show some ideas about like how to question other ways of, or proposing other ways of showing film. In her treatment of an aesthetic of the installation, Juliana Riebentisch demonstrated how, through the break with classic cinema architecture and in connection with the new possibilities of the electronic image, the spatial presentation form of film could be radically modified. In this way, Riebentisch aligned herself with Gilles Deleuze, who also stressed with regard to the electronic image that the organization of space with the proliferating new format now, I quote, loses its privileged direction. First and foremost, the privilege of the vertical to which the projection screen continues to be a testament, in favor of an undirected space which relentlessly transforms its angles and coordinates and transposes its verticals and horizontals. The potential of the moving image appears everywhere, distributed to monitors and projection screens, on the floor, on the ceiling, and no longer has to be perceived by a frontally orientated seated audience. Instead, it is increasingly necessary to walk through installations and to enter into relationship of space, pictorial space, and viewer while in motion. It becomes apparent that this transformation not only was essential with regard to film, but also signified a gain for thought in the indicated categories of space, pictorial space, and viewer. It is now possible to recognize an interdependency that in the past had not often revealed itself. Not only does it appear that space is determined by the gaze of the viewer, but space likewise appears as the determiner of the gaze, and thus exposes what Martin Zeil in his investigation addressed as possible other ways of looking at the world, revealed as a constant oscillation between determining and self-determining. In this way, like so to look at images, but the images also configure our way of looking at them. In this way, the new image space merely becomes an active being that no longer only reflects what it is cast into by the human spectator. Instead, space becomes an agent, from the Latin agens, an agent. That a world that confronts the subject would be equipped with such potential, however, shakes the foundations of our accustomed modes of thinking. And it is interesting to observe that although this idea is actually connected with a transformation that has developed particularly rapidly in the course of the 20th century from thinking in terms of static, absolute spaces and bodies to a thinking in terms of dynamically relational spaces. This idea, nevertheless, continues to be deeply unsettling. not just in terms of thinking of spaces that are in movement, but also like that our own identities. So coming back to the idea of the individual, maybe what individual are we talking about? Is that a kind of container space that we want to redefine, or are we on the way redefining this more in a kind of flux or movement and a kind of relational momentum? Just a second. In addition to the possibility for another way of thinking about space that arose with the shift from the film to the filmic installations, for Boris Greuß, this moment would simply represent the first really analytical access to the medium of film. Well, for him, for Boris Greuß, the immobility of the spectator in the cinema also perforce led to a mental passivity. In Greuß's view, it was in the format of the installation that film was finally able to rise to its intellectual potential. Well, that this quite positivistic perspective on a new development was not only unjust to experimental film in the theater, but was not unproblematic with regards to the new development itself, would soon become evident. One major reason for this was the sharply increasing number of film installations and the consequence that precisely because of these installations and their open form, the impression was often created of a gratuitous availability of images. It is interesting that the architecture of the museum thereby visibly functioned as the cutter of a film. It spliced individual works and streams of images all the more densely into another, so that at times these could hardly be distinguished anymore. So this is something that I really would stress for any kind of biennial, to be really aware how video installations are presented in biennials and treated with respect, not overlaying, for instance, the audio layerings, and that I don't know in which media installation I'm standing at the very moment. The result was entirely contrary to the Greuzian expectation of the peripatetic analysis. Instead, the experience thus granted was often more like intoxication through images. But even specifically in sight of this development, it is necessary not to revert to the answering schemes that present themselves and once again position the black box inside the museum. In addition, we need to go beyond the walls of the museum and need to think about the city as image machinery. It is necessary, as Ian White formulated in his essay, Kino Museum, to continue to pose the question of the institutional conditions of the cinema, the museum, or the stream of media architectures, and thus, above all, consistently to re-engage with the question of potentials of spatiality in an open play of apparatus and subject. And maybe that leads, I skipped the last part on the architectural examples that I had in mind, but what arises from all this includes the demand by Felix Guattari for a reconsideration of long overdue of the concept of the machine, that I think. And I quote, "In order to emerge from the fascination with technology and the debasing from that it sometimes assumes, we actually need to conceive of the machine in a new way, to conceptualize it differently and perceive from the basis of the being of the machine as sometimes that standard at the crossroad of being and its activity, its character of nothingness, and the subjective individuation of the collective subjectivity," meaning not opposing the machine as the other, but thinking about ourselves of being machines and how we evolve and connect and maybe merge at certain points into each other. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 너무 흥미로운 주제로 아주 재미난 발표를 해주셨는데 우리 처음에 발표하셨던 유진상 감독님과 그리고 마크 브래드 씨 두 분 모두 이야기를 들으면서 우리가 느꼈던 것은 도대체 얼마나 인류의 이 예술과 과학과 테크놀로지와 모든 것을 통합하는 이 능력이 무궁무진하다는 것, 그리고 깊이 있는 철학적인 문제, 그리고 우리의 지각과 공간에 관한 문제를 아주 깊이 생각해 볼 수 있는 아주 흥미로운 시간이었다고 생각됩니다. 그래서 지금부터는 이번 섹션 1 중에 그 마지막 발표자로서 유키코 시가타 씨의 발표를 들으면서 우리에게 충격을 주었던 그 얼마 전에 있었던 사건 3.11이라고 여러분 다 기억하실 텐데, 그것 이후 또 일본이 당면하고 있는 문제와 그것이 결국은 일본만의 문제는 또 아니지 않습니까? 그래서 우리 전 인류의 문제이기도 한데, 그 부분에 대해서 우리의 예술과 삶과 과학과 이 모든 것이 어떻게 우리 모든 인류에 또 영향을 미치고 우리가 어떻게 나아가실 것인가 하는 그런 국적인 문제에 대해서 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 시작해 주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. So I start my presentation. As you see, it's clear. I'm speaking on the issue after 9/11. It's a kind of how situation in all of Japan, also including me. I've been, in a way, also I had some problem, and also many things has changed after that day. And finally, last month, I get a bit recovered. But it was a hard time. And I think we can share this kind of feeling, not only Japan, because the information goes beyond borders, national borders, also environment, pollution going beyond borders. So now we are living in an age that we can share the situation. Then we can also start to think what is different, but also at the same time we can think from each point of view, living at each place on Earth. So I start. The end of the year 2011 is approaching, but I'm sure that this year will be strongly remembered with the date March 11. The day that the incredibly strong earthquake hit the broader part of northeast Japan, followed by the serious accident of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactors. Since that day, people all over Japan share the feeling that we cannot return to the same state as before, including me. Especially serious radioactive contamination in Fukushima and surrounding area will stay incredibly long period. It will influence the ecosystem of the Earth beyond human scale by time and space. The accident on 11 was very heavy, especially in terms of Fukushima, and I think we Japanese have to not only live with this situation, but also have to consider seriously why it was caused and how we could learn from this to open the new society heading for the future. We are defeated, but in the time of crisis, they open the space to possibly review and change the existing systems where some hope locates. But this space will soon disappear, and the human is the entity to forget the past to survive everyday life. So first of all, we have to face the situation and contemplate, then to start to act before it's getting too late. In Asahi newspaper interview on April 7th, Minoru Kawakita, a historian, told, "What happened in the 3/11 strongly made us question the meaning of the modern society and belief to develop, being driven by science and technology." Yoshitaka Yamamoto, and science history and natural philosophy wrote on the human responsibility on the issue of nuclear fission. All the translation is made by me from Japanese. The human has to be thoroughly aware that it is fundamentally beyond human capacity and strictly prohibited to execute the nuclear fission artificially and produce deadly poisonous plutonium that does not originally exist in nature. So this kind of activity is happening in space, but not on Earth or in nature. So it's a very, very artificial and not natural things that the people produce the plutonium or people make the nuclear plants. I think 311 clearly unveiled us that the existing systems being established since the modern Europe, where the humans started to conquer and control the nature, do not function properly. One marvelous issue disclosed was the fact that the system is based on the national and the top-down power system, with the gaps between city and country, rich and poor, and so on. It also disclosed the dysfunction of reductive modern science that became monopolized by national corporate entities. The modern system, originally being established on the idea of democracy, was changed especially in the second half of 20th century, driven by the economic growth, and expanded the above gaps. Especially these few years, I noticed that the possible fundamental shift of the society and the episteme into more flat and interactive communication, information sharing, personal engagement based on everyday life, driven by the diffusion of digital information networks in the fields such as art, creation, curating, science, politics, and so on. Since 2000, I've been curating exhibitions and projects that are based on the idea of self-organization of information and the possible info ecosystem beyond digital and analog. These ideas were shown clearly in the first project called Polar by Carlson Nicola, he's based in Berlin, and Marco Pejan, originally from Slovenia, and Polar M. It was the project after 10 years of Polar, which was the second version produced by the same artists and curators, where they dealt with the visualization of ever-changing natural radioactivity from the space, stones, and visitors. Human also have the radioactivities to the project. And since Polar 2000, I developed this direction through many exhibitions and projects, including a model suspension. This project, I just briefly show you the bus project, and all process-based projects. Now I want to show you two projects. In one of the latest projects called Mission G, Sensing the Earth, I introduced a new situation in combining art and science that introduced individuals to DIY, do-it-yourself, for measuring the environmental data and shared by the bottom-up reflection of the Earth. After 311, many individuals, especially in and around Tokyo area, started to measure the radioactivity level of surroundings and open the data on the web. Suddenly, now I want to show you the project here moving. So it doesn't work, so I want to show you other way. The sound, I forgot to put the sound output, but it's just the sound for the video, so it's not the problem basically. It's about 5 minutes. possible, can you put the light a little off? Darker, a little bit?
조금만 낮춰주세요.
A bit brighter, possibly?
조금만
The cinema, like Marco.
이제 이렇게.
Yeah, it's okay, thank you. Yeah, this exhibition was held between 2009 and 2010, and 10 months with 5 projects. Basically, a new type of architecture project from a different kind of architects. So all the projects measure the environmental data from outside of the exhibition space, from satellite, environmental satellite, to some other places. They utilized. Real-time showing real-time data from outside. I take the data and each work is slightly changed, but we don't know. Nobody knows what happened because not so many human interactions, but only environmental change will be reflected into the space. Also, there was an installation by the person who were in a shore station in Antarctic. So he actually had no chance to see the exhibition, but he was over 1 year in Antarctica. So we got the data, latest data from him from Antarctica by blog or by video, and we had a real-time streaming from shore station. Finished. Then maybe another movie might not work on the PowerPoint, so I want to show you from here. And this is an exhibition named Polar M. I just briefly introduce Polar by Carson, Nicola, and Marco Pellihan. And this is a project we collaborated and realized last year, after 10 years. This was shown from last year, November last year until early February this year at the WICAM, Yamaguchi Center for Arts and Media in Yamaguchi City, west part of Japan. getting the radioactivities. We had many Geiger counters in the space, analog and digital. Some very old one from Eastern Germany. Then we measure the variety of radioactivities and change it into sound and lights and images. Yamaguchi is strong in radioactivity. There are many granite stones from this local area, so we use those stones in the installation. And we be back again to the point. Thank you. So, the sweet ribbon just happened after 1 month after we finished the polar installation. So, and then people started to use the Geiger counter intentionally in daily life. So somehow we couldn't imagine anything like this 1 year ago. But now the society has a lot changed, and people awareness to the invisible things, especially radioactivity, is very much growing. Yeah. Just briefly explain the contents of the project. Can you read down, maybe? Yes, I hope that I want to show some of the images that this kind of like the square size is 7 meter, and 4 meter high, and there are double, 2. And the original polar we had only 1 cube, but at polar 2 we have 2 and 1 people can get inside, the other people cannot get inside. So it's a kind of a twin, but looks the same, almost the same, but you can have an internal observation on the right box, right cube, but only external observation at the cube on the left. So many granite stone, the Geiger counters. And this is the zoom up of the cloud chamber. It's scientific actually equipment or machines to visualize the radioactive things, particles. And this is the view from inside the cube. So now we live in a world that information, environmental and economical data circulate and influence globally beyond national borders. Now people started to feel sympathy to friends beyond spatial distance and nationality, and the notion of identity or privacy is gradually changing into the connected self or shared self. People can get huge amount of information to digest and filter and output it as an info curators, and it will be shared and further digested and output by somebody. So I'm talking about the current situation in society, but also in arts, by combining art and science. By the diffusion of DIY and knowledge sharing in hardware software, each can make his work or project, and people can also collaborate. Here, one example that capture the emerging new info ecosystem, particularly in the Japanese context, can be seen in the critic Satoshi Hamano's text on the possibility of democracy 2.0. The principle of modern democracy, based on the idea of deliberation by mature individual, is now being questioned. And in the current information environment, it is not the individual that deliberates, but the environment that deliberates. it's interesting opinion. And yeah, we have in Japan we have many kind of virtual characters and many info-based systems. Then we have a growing number of Twitter, and Twitter in Japanese is about 12% of used in the world. So we have high rates. So we have this kind of virtual and real and connected self and identity of physicality, I think. So this the existing system is very rigid and still dominating, but people notify it's not a real democracy, and the potentials to shift into a society based on the emerging self-organizing ecosystem where each takes responsibility in everyday life to think, act, and collaborate. The new democracy is not only shared globally by the human, but to be shared with other living creatures. This is my idea. And other living creatures or other non-living entities and nature on Earth. It would be also based on our imagination, not only for all the entities on Earth, but also for the people to be born, and all the entity on Earth in the near and far future. So we have to see the world in a scale, expanded scale by time and space, not only the living things on Earth at this moment. And only the human living on Earth at each time can think and act for that. Because the future people, the coming people, or the people cannot work for this. So at least we can do something, or we should do something. And animals cannot do it easily. So animals can maybe show some dangers, but only human can do something for the future and for the present Earth. So it's time for us to recover from the reductive, obstructive approach and to start nurturing our thought by sensitively sensing the world by each. And Toshinaru Sasaki, an IT journalist, wrote that in a global platform, enormous infobiotopes are formed in social networking media, and he located a curator as a person to connect to these biotopes to present his or her perspectives. The followers of each curator check in the perspectives of curator. Then the ecosystem emerges by consistently changing the relations. So everybody can be a curator, by information curator, and people can also, output this information. Then other people can also collect the information, various kind of information, and to be as a curator, they can also output. So interesting information changes, formation filtering, is now happening. So this one about 1 year. Since last year in spring, I always thinking how to curate the future. So it's expanded notion of curating. But now I can also say curating the world or curating the future. Maybe we can say in the early 20th century, 100 years ago, there was a kind of interesting phenomenon in artwork, like a collage or using ready-made, putting the, defining ready-made object as an artwork. So it's also a definition and also editing the notions. But now we can also expand this kind of editing into curating. Also we can use not only daily commodity like 100 years ago, we can also use the digital-based information, so we can also connect these things. So this is the German artist, and Joseph Beuys once thought that everybody is an artist, and I want to say, I want to extend into this, everybody is an artist, but not only artist, but scientist, philosopher, and curator, a sensitive sensor, filter, and mediator. It doesn't mean that existing professionals will be endangered by the people broadly starting engaging in various fields. Instead, it will stimulate the professionals and to sharpen their sense throughout sense and thought and skill to activate the world. Art, life, and science society are ready to merge each other again for each of us, but it was necessary for all of us to develop our consciousness by experiencing the modernization process. There will be various products, visible, invisible, material, information, and others ahead of us, from us, where the notion of economy will be free from the existing capitalistic way, but still will produce more cultural value. So the economy can be also renewed by the information process. And it will lead the alternative type of economy with bottom-up, autonomous, interdependence. I like the word interdependence. Open, flow-based, where we are ahead for the new notion of a public based on the new democracy and the new ecosystem. So I would like to raise some Japanese examples from now. Yeah, it's an old essay from early 13th century. Kamano Chomen is famous. During his age, he had observed many catastrophes, disasters like a fire or earthquake and flood and others. And he wrote, this is the starting point of his essay. Ceaselessly the river flows, and yet the water is never the same. While in a still pools, the shifting foam gathers and is gone, never staying for a moment. This kind of mentality is, in a way, in our identity, I think. And this is one more quotation from Octavio Paz. In 1983, Japanese took the foreign thought, technologies and systems and modified them to be fit into things purely Japanese-like. Japanese history proves the work of Aristotle that all true creation starts from mimesis. So two more quotations I want to finish. Then Hiroki Azuma, Gender Will 2.0, the book came out later last month. Rousseau, Freud, Google. And this was originally written between winter 2009, spring 2011. Japanese is good in reading the air and in using IT. It will be better for us to conceive a new democracy by technically visualizing the air to use it as a base of consensus by stop seeking to the idea of deliberation. We are not good at. Then this is one sentence I quoted. So we don't have to insist that democracy is originally from Europe, US, and doesn't fit us. Rather, we have to appeal that because we accept the universal aspect of democracy and to make the idea truly universal, the experience in Japanese society would benefit. The last quotation. The future government doesn't necessarily deny the deliberation. Rather, it would have two aspects: actively absorbing the unconsciousness of citizens in one hand, and activating the conscious communication between them in the other hand. So, at the last point, this is my question or something to raise you. For the new public to merge with art, life science society by intermediating consciousness and unconsciousness, independency and interdependency, theory and physicality. Also, it's related to the haptic things that you also raised. So, art take a role. A new broader notion of art would afford mediating those things together. I hope. Thank you.
비주얼 미디어에서 소셜 미디어로라는 주제로 지금 얘기를 또 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you and good afternoon. First of all, thank you for inviting me at the 7th Seoul Media Arts International Symposium. It's been an honor to be here. First time in Korea, so discovery. My name is Olof van Winden. I am the initiator and the artistic director of the Curators Festival, which is an international festival beyond art organized in Brussels. Next to that, I recently became the director of the Netherlands Media Arts Institute based in Amsterdam. I'm also in the jury for the Art and Technology Award in the Netherlands and member of the International Committee of the Mondrian Foundation, which is supporting art on an international scale. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I will do a keynote directly on the microphone. Advertising has made us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate, so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, no purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depressions. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depressions is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we would all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars. But we won't. And we're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off. That's a little bit related on the situation in Europe right now. I don't know how it is in Asia at the moment. But we're facing some severe cuts, and our political system is a bit scary at the moment, especially for culture, science, and education. So much like the shifting relationship between social movement and NGOs, 10-15 years ago, we see a growing tension between the existing models of cultural organizations that deal with new media culture and arts versus informal networks. Unlike a decade ago, the cultural new media sector can no longer claim to embody the avant-garde position because that has been taken over by the market. This situation leads to a void. Neither truly innovative nor particularly critical new media organizations in the non-profit sector are starting to float. They are not doing proper research either, or at least not what policymakers and academics consider useful. Should they then all just be closed now that the introductory phase of new media is coming to a close? The massive digitalization of cultural heritage has proven to be useless for the new media sector and has merely reproduced the existing conservative cultural landscape that is dominated by museums, opera and concert halls. Instead of aligning ourselves with the creative industry's agendas, the proposal here would be to transform the current organizational model into facilitating hubs that empower organized networks. Over the last years, there has been both theoretical and practical work to find out how we can develop new institutional forms. That's what I've been doing the past couple of months since we heard that the funding for the Netherlands Media Arts Institute will be cut for 100%. So it's not enough for us to submerge in this bitter insider-outsider logic or ever diminishing budgets. It's time to invent our own source of income. The first step for this would be to recognize the ideology of free and open, such advocated by some in the free cultural movement as a trap. We also need a new notion of the public domain and public broadcasting in particular, in which new media have an equal status next to film, public radio and television, and subsidized print also. Bar camps, conferences, booksprints, festivals, bricolabs, and our recent statement in the Netherlands Media Art We Care are all manifestations of a thriving culture. Instead of asking how these emerging practices can contribute to policy, we should reverse this question. How can cultural policy strengthen networks? Maybe we should also look at the definition of media arts or new media arts. I'm presenting here 4 aspects to distinguish some crucial aspects that deals with contemporary art production today. First, digital art production is default. I mean that our daily culture is characterized more by Facebook, Twitter, Google, digital photography, YouTube, MP3s, file sharing, iPads, smartphones, than by pencils and paintings, or guitar songs around the campfire, or even television. Our culture is digital, and the non-digital culture is closely linked to the digital anyways. The computer is the main production platform for art, and is therefore almost invisible. Second, the database paradigm prevails. The idea that a library of data, property, and that as an artist invents operations or algorithms to do something with that data, to make them interact, combine or merge, confront or to create aesthetic experiences, is the most obvious way to make art. The third issue is that the computer became the meta-medium used by artists. That's a known, crystallized, and immediately available solution. For example, the software for photography or audio software. It may be that an artist's technology put more into their own hands by manipulating this software. Do-it-yourself ideology requires to adjust this technology to create personal and meaningful work to come instead of a ready-made pattern to apply. The fourth key issue is that it's all about what art does in general, not specifically new media art. What meaning it creates, what experience and emotions it evokes, what questions are raised, how it shows the complexity of an issue, and so on. That is what I think matters right now, not whether something fits into the definition of media art or not. Because new media arts are developing so quickly. It started basically with video art, later became unstable media, virtual reality, net art, now it's RFID, GPS, architecture, mobile technology, smart textiles, or even biotechnology, if biotech is considered a media. That art is interested in these methods is not primarily because of a sheer love of technology, and for the sake of experiment to experiment, but because these technology in society and economy and culture are shaping the world today. The important issues of our time are contained in these technologies, used by so many. Those who ask questions about how we live our lives to organize out the world, even what beauty is, will probably end up with new media anyways. So a little bit about the Dutch perspective. I can almost say the European perspective. We wrote a statement to our government, which we also released online, and I will read this statement briefly. It's called Media Art We Care. The Dutch Secretary of State for Culture, Mr. Halbe Zijlstra, has published his policy plans for the coming years on June 10th. In contrast to the official recommendations given to him by the advisory board, these historic cutbacks will not be spread out over a number of years, but will take immediate effect as of January 2013. Next to the devastating effect for the whole field of emerging art and innovation, this means that the Netherlands Media Arts Institute, which I represent, is facing a 100% cut in its structural governmental funding. Ever since the foundation of the Montevideo Gallery in 1978, The Netherlands Media Arts Institute has specialized in media and electronic art that seeks the creative possibility of contemporary media and technology. Today, we are an internationally renowned and all around the world cultural organization active and recognized in the area of creations, presentation, research, and especially conservation of media art. The collection of the Netherlands Media Art Institute consists of 2,500 works. 500 of them are international artists, and is basically the beating heart of the institute. Historically, international exchanges have always been an essential part of media art. At this moment, we annually distribute works from our collection to up to 45 countries worldwide. The total spectrum of activities include exhibitions, education and research, and a high level of international cooperation. Through such diverse functions, the Institute fulfills its role as an intermediary in the media art sector, building bridges between artists, art institutions, and the public. A center of expertise that makes its resources widely available, but at the same time also a middleman. Contrary to all recommendations and expectations, we are now facing major challenges in keeping the Institute alive in order to remain an active leading player in the field of art, technology, and innovation. We are very much aware that the days of individualism are history. Alliances within and beyond the arts, partnerships and shared leadership will be key to help us through these unstable economical, political, and social times. The Netherlands Media Arts Institute, being a valuable node in an international network, believed in the strength of this institute, the sector, and the potential of the artists and our partners. We are dedicated to invest all of our energy and efforts to keep media art vibrant and alive. So these big challenges are also raising questions, because maybe we're just coming to the fact that we became obsolete. I think not. But I think that we also have to adapt our mission. We have a responsibility based on heritage, but also the function as a production facility for artists. So we have to find new market opportunities and focus on cultural entrepreneurship, new audiences and participation. Maybe we should look at the music industry that collapsed also a couple of years ago. The whole model turned upside down. Before, an artist, a musician was making money on his album and was doing a tour to promote his album. And the tour costs. Now it's the other way around. Making an album doesn't generate revenue, but it's a promotional tool for the tours that they are doing, and they make money on the tour. So our ambition and creative energy is greater than ever. We are curious about the future and have confidence in our network of partners, artists and audiences. But how to fill this void? A jump in a vacuum where everything from cultural, political, and social values seem to disappear. If we do nothing, nothing happens. And all that was left was what we were doing. So we choose to lead into the void. Thank you.
Just preface this by saying I've just worked out that in the last 36 hours I've slept for 2 of them because of a technological failure with Qantas, and I missed my flight. So please bear with me if I look a bit tired. I've got a written paper, but it's been really interesting to hear all the speakers here, and I feel it's like the meat of what we do, the important things of what we do, as the talks this morning, and then I think we're in a sort of a slightly similar boat in terms of the challenges ahead for small media organisation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. I'll tell you a little bit about Experimenta, and about our forthcoming biennale, and also about some of the issues we're facing. So, Experimenta is a media arts organisation based in Melbourne, Australia. It was formed in 1986, initially out of an interest in experimental film to support artists who work in that area, but over those 25 years it's evolved, and we now sort of work to promote media arts generally. We advise corporate and public agencies, we work on commissions, and probably the core of what we do is a biennial exhibition that we have in Melbourne and then we tour. We're not a sort of monolithic institution by any means. We've got no permanent exhibition space, and we have 4 full-time staff. And as I say, I've just stepped into the role of acting director just a few weeks ago, so I'm still learning the ropes. But what we do is we rely and we pride ourselves on our ability to be responsive and reactive to the environment around us, to how artists are changing and to how our audiences are changing, and of course to how the financial environment is changing as well. So as I say, we curate a biennial exhibition. This is just an image of one of the ones we did earlier. And again, this institution is the Victorian Arts Centre. It's a big monolithic kind of thing that's sloped down the middle of Melbourne. And we transformed it. And this is the sort of thing we do. We transform architectural spaces and make them work for us. It's very interesting. Earlier alluding to the architectural matches with digital art, because that's something we're very interested in. This was a commission we did with Art Fair, Melbourne Art Fair in Melbourne. We did a project. So we often will do that. We'll partner. That issue you commented on earlier about partnering was something we had to deal with, and so we have a number of partners that we do little pop-ups for Sydney Festival, things like that. So, as I say, we work with a range of partners. Docklands, which is a development over the last 20 years next to Melbourne, which is the same size as the Melbourne CBD. It was a sort of land, the docks obviously, that was reclaimed, and we've done a lot of artworks down there, digital and moving image, with both corporate and public partners. This was a huge, it's a terrible image, and I must apologise, but it was a huge sort of 11-metre long multi-channel work by Daniel Crooks, who's a Melbourne video artist. And it's in one of the major centres, one of the major corporate centres, the ANZ Bank in London. So, yes, so you'll see there's a few of these things. This was the Sydney Festival. So, that partnership thing we've kind of got down pretty well. We've been very successful, I think, probably more successful than a lot of museums at really accessing new audiences. We've got, this is a seniors group, they come in, they're fascinated by the technology, and they'll come to a gallery when they may never have bothered to visit one in the past. The exhibition we had in Melbourne recently, a couple of years ago, I should say, for the last biennale, we had just thousands and thousands, like 50,000 people turn up to the opening. And they're audiences that would never have come to a gallery space, but they were in all sorts of niche communities, and I think that's one of the interesting areas too, that we access gamers, people like that. So these are, here we are, education. So this is a strong arm of also what we do, is we provide a sort of educational and promotional advocacy group with media art. We work with schools, seniors groups, we do public programs for artists, and as I say, all of these we have to find partners for. So it could be the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, a university, a gallery, a University of the Third Age, could be any group, and we just sort of latch on and provide that kind of material for them. Yes, time, public forums. But, so these are these 3 objectives we have. We have commissioning, exhibiting and touring. And they all sort of unite in this realisation of a major international biennial of media art. I mean, probably nothing quite as substantial as the one that you're going to enjoy next year, but it's certainly one that we enjoy. And we then tour it for the following sort of 2 years to 18 months after it's premiered in Melbourne. So our 2-year cycle, just to give you a sense, these are a couple of the last ones. You'll see again the spaces, they're not necessarily gallery spaces, but we kind of try and rework them. Here's the last 4 we've had. And this was, we partnered last year with, last year and this year, with a new public museum, a private museum that's just opened in Tasmania and Hobart, called the Museum of Old and New Art, and it's the largest private museum Metropolitan in Australia. It's caused quite a stir because he's kind of broken a lot of the rules of normal museum practice. He's just jamming all sorts of objects up next to each other. It's quite an eccentric collector called David Walsh in Tasmania. And we were very lucky to partner with him because he has a genuine interest in media arts and just really has no boundaries for the way he works. So, yes, our 2-year cycle starts with a commissioning project. We put a call out, and it's mainly Australian artists, and we get many applications, and we usually pick around 6 of those people. We provide financial support, so we give them a little bit of money. We provide them with a professional development structure. Some of them come with we want them to come with very ambitious projects, and then we provide a lot of support for them to realise those projects. And we've got that kind of 18-month period to put it together. Now, a lot of our past commissioned artists, you know, we like to go from an emerging stage when they're not kind of fully formed artists. And what we've found is that support provided in those early stages of their career has assisted them to kind of move on, and many of them have really bloomed from that point. They've exhibited internationally, they've been acquired by major public and private collectors, they've attracted lucrative public commissions, and they've got, you know, not that this is necessarily a measure of one's great artistic, you know, value, but they have achieved some commercial success. And of course they also go into our biennial exhibition. So while working with those commissioned artists, we develop a curatorial profile of what the next year's biennial will be, and we start to confirm the venues. And the venues is always an interesting one, because as I say, we like to look at all sorts of different spaces. We like to have a street profile, work with existing architecture, and it was interesting hearing you talk about the idea of the city and how it can work for you as a machine too. And we like to do that. We also like to go into the regional Australia. As many of you would know, Australia, it's a big place, and a lot of contemporary artists are clustered just around the edges. And now the thing about digital art and internet-based works is it allows us to kind of have quite a long reach into the regional areas, but we do like to physically go there. So because we don't have a site, we can do that, and we do a very extensive regional tour. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about the New Biennial, but I just want to talk about some of those issues that are facing us, and I know they've been raised by Olaf. And they're about that changing environment, and what could only be described as sort of being a victim of our own success now that media arts enter the kind of mainstream. And finally, where the media artists go and how they can make a difference now. So up until now, for the last 4 biennials and the various exhibitions and commissions, we've sort of extended that traditional audience, as I mentioned, for contemporary art to include regional and country audiences, young people, the niche groups, video artists, animators, gamers. We have all kinds of people who come to our shows. But I'm just wondering how if that can continue, because it's been a bit of a novelty up till now. Because now we've had almost 3 generations who've been using, and we commented on this, but using computers in schools. And at the end of 2011, technology is not just part of our everyday lives, it runs it, well, usually except when it's Qantas, and then it doesn't run it, makes me late. And so other than that, it runs it very well. The past held view that artists were the first to take on these new advances in technology, be it a camera or a printing press, and then test them and extend them and reinvent them. Well, I'm not entirely sure if that's the case anymore with technology. The technology isn't the domain of either the artist or the scientist, and it's firmly in the hands of the consumer and the audience. And following on from Hugo's comments, perhaps we all are those artists and curators and scientists. We're personalising our interfaces, we're curating our worlds, we're testing the gadgets, we're using them as an expression of who we are. We're no longer excited by the tricks of light, and we now expect a newer, better bit of technology to make the one that we just bought redundant within a moment of buying it. And that expectation extends to our cultural consumption. So my feeling is that media art's now being mainstream. I mean, I can still remember a time when people argued over whether photography could be art, but it's not like that anymore. And similarly, such sort of arguments about media art are defunct. Now, I said that, but when we were talking about the shop before, I remembered that I just have to say, always have to make an argument for ready-mades. I talk very broadly to audiences. I wear a number of hats when I'm in Melbourne, and I find myself often, as I say, in regional audiences or with non-art audiences, and I always have to explain why a ready-made is an artwork. So while I say these media art is part of the mainstream, I'm recognising that there is, of course, a huge public who's still challenged by it, but I think in terms of the art institutions we're talking about, it really is very mainstream. So yes, having said that, over the last 10 years or so, video art, media art, it's all become very common by any means. I think we mentioned that earlier. Exhibitions, galleries, it's risen in prominence in the commercial sector, which is largely where I've spent most of my professional life, is in the commercial sector of the visual arts, contemporary art. And I used to be asked, I still am asked occasionally, is it hard to sell media art? And I just have to say, it's no harder, it's no harder than selling a painting or a print. In fact, in some ways it's easier now because people, they recognise that we've got a generation of collectors coming up who feel totally comfortable with a video playing on their wall on a flat screen television. They have no issue with that at all, or even having a construction that will play data out to them. So I'm slightly surprised by it, but I have to say it's true that we don't have that challenge anymore. As soon as we were able to realise and resolve the issues of trading a more elusive object, it became fine. It's all about the trade. So we've got museums and organisations around Australia that are now commonly collecting and exhibiting works that may have in the past sat sort of in an avant-garde hinterland. They may be defined as technology art, as over sort of techy, or just confusing. In short, media art no longer sits in the experimental area, but it's really across all contemporary practice, from video art, animation, robotics, immersive environments. They're sort of multi-platform, multi-sensory. They're all kind of in the contemporary art world now. Moreover, when we go to a museum, not only would we be seeing all this kind of work, we'd also be receiving information about it on our iPod or our plug-in or whatever, or we're getting information on the download from the web before we go. It's just part of everything we do. And so, in all that, artists are the instigators of that transformation. They've been the instigators of it. But they're also managing the consequences of it too. So, in a time when contemporary art has expanded to encompass multiple practices and techniques, the hallmark of that is fluidity, and I do think that's what artists have it over many people. So that's the funfair aspect of art with digital technology, that kind of gee whiz thing. I think that's really over. And artists are now using technology in a more sort of nuanced way in their art, simply as a medium, and they're moving away from the technological focus of media art and making work that emphasises individual experiences and their interactions with our cultures, our histories, and ultimately with each other. They're often tactile and embodied, and these responses are as multiple as the ways in which we communicate. We currently communicate and encompass all of the idiosyncratic, awkward and surprising moments along the way. And I think that's what we've been referring to, that thing of the individual. I do think that's where artists sort of really succeed in managing that gap between the individual and the community. I'm not flicking on, I should be flicking. So, if other larger organisations and institutions are now commonly presenting media art or work that's screen-based, that utilises a range of digital technologies, work that's interactive, gamer work, then that really presents a challenge to small niche organisations like us, as I say, I guess, like Mark too. So we're now starting to question ourselves, and having promoted media art so successfully, so vigorously, I'm now wondering whether we're kind of a victim of our own success. I think like Mark, in Australia we recently had a funding round, and we are largely funded by the government, by state and federal funding. And the federal agency, there are three key media organisations in Australia, and two of them were cut quite severely, one completely, and one had about 2/3 of its funding cut. We luckily were held stable, but there were a lot of warning noises out there. So while I'm happy to say we're in a slightly better position than Mark, we are still challenged. We really do have to find a good argument for why we exist and what are we there for. And we don't have a collection, and we don't have a building, so it's an interesting challenge to find ourselves there. So having said that, of course, that all this funding is being cut, meanwhile, you have these institutions like MINA that I referred to earlier, and the new Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, which has just been completely refurbished. And there are huge investments there, financial investments in new infrastructure. Both in infrastructure, I should say, the technology, but also in their collecting, their acquisitions. They've been given a lot more funds to acquire those sorts of works. So, anyway, so the access and engagement with technology on almost every level has created new platforms of audience engagement for presenting works as well. That interconnectivity and online presence has created digital communities with far greater numbers than we ever imagined. So we're no longer limited by physical space. And these major arts organisations now realise that they have the ability to access these huge audiences, much greater audiences than ever before. And the potentiality of that, of a vast virtual audience, means that arts organisations are now delving into new levels of audience engagement, creating multi-platform experiences through online presences, not just their educational resources, but also commissioning artists to make interactive works online, to make works with their iPods that they take around with them, or smartphones. So that's something that we've been doing for quite a while now, and so again, as I say, we're wondering where that leaves us, although, as I say, I do think there's great value in the physical nature of taking these exhibitions to these communities, which is what we are quite capable of doing. So, I've been thinking about this I've only been in this job for about 3 or 4 weeks, and these funding issues have only just come up in the last month, so this has been why I've been thinking about them furiously. And it's been interesting to think about the future and where we're going to go. And we're looking at this next biennial that's coming up. And I think that it is something to do with the focus of these exhibitions. So our previous exhibition focus has been on engaging audiences through the interactivity of the works, the technology base of the works. And so often they've been, as I say, like those earlier works with the cups, they've been quite playful, and there's a relationship between the audience and the works themselves. But now that everyone's pretty much engaging with technology every day, or rather using technology to engage with their community, their friends, their family, and to reflect on themselves, I think experimental will have to move the focus back to what artists are trying to actually say. And I think, again, it goes to what I was saying about what artists can do in the world, or what we all can do, perhaps, as creative individuals in the world, and how we can make sense of this changing world, this changing sense of what it is to be an individual and communicate. So, as a result, we've our next biennial is actually going to be called Experimenter Speak to Me. And perhaps that's where I think we can resolve some of these things. So, launching in September 2012, again, but in a range of venues in Melbourne, Experimenter Speak to Me will showcase media artworks by international and Australian artists, including all going well, these commissioning artists that we're working with now. And following that launch, the exhibition will then tour. And it'll tour, as I say, to a number of venues throughout Australia, and then hopefully to a number of international venues as well. So we see this Experimenter Speak to Me as an invitation to consider what it means at this time to be together, physically and virtually. Our ability to communicate with each other everywhere, all the time, that sort of ultimate interconnectivity has been with us for some time, but we're sort of interested in how artists might perceive that with these technologies. So we've seen previously impenetrable boundaries become redundant to the extent where relationships can now exist sometimes more successfully in a parallel universe or second life. As this capacity for connectedness is integrated more and more into our lives, it affects many of our significant daily actions and the way we engage with the people around us. This is a bit of on the side, but I have a teenage daughter, she's 15, and recently at her school they asked the girls to all see how much time they spent relating to other people on technologies, actively relating. So they had to look at Twitter, their internet, their phones, Skype, whatever they did, and they had to sort of work it out as a percentage of a 24-hour period, and they came up in the end that they were connected 180% of the time, which doesn't really make sense until you think what it meant was they were connected via more than one platform frequently. I mean, if you accept that they were sleeping for 8 hours, you know, they were connecting with that, and they're connecting with their friends and all those people around them. So, I mean, that surely must make a difference to the way they're communicating or seeing themselves in the world. Anyway, I'm really hoping artists will make some sense of that. For me, I can tell you with another. So yeah, so what does that connectedness offer us, you know, and how are the artists going to use that very technology to reflect these ideas backwards? So that promise of the internet, with its heady blend of freedom, democracy, and dissolution of information hierarchies, and I sort of question that, of course, offers a world-changing agency inherent in our new capacities to organise and to communicate. Yeah, so as I say, I think that potentiality has yet to be fully realised, and the fallout from this diminished promise has left us in a slightly unstable place. So if interconnectivity isn't offering us freedom, then what does it do? Technological hyperdrive can potentially be distancing from ourselves. And I do wonder about that when I thought about this generation who are constantly connected, but I'm actually not entirely sure that they're any less distant than we felt as teenagers. So, you know. So in this experimental biennale, it'll be presented across the 5 sites. So we'll be in external public places. We'll be going to where those audiences are. We'll be encroaching on city buildings, both inside and out. We'll have public and interactive works, videos, robotics. Again, we'll do the educational resources. We'll use iPads. We'll be kind of getting in between all those cracks and trying to get to our audiences however we can, because we've recognised that is really the only way to go now with the audience. Now, I'm just going to talk very briefly. I'll just flick through some of these images. These are just giving you an idea of the sorts of things we've done in the past. And of course, it's a bit pointless because they're all still images, when of course they're all moving images in real life. These are interactive ones. These are all commissions. Stark, of course, great Australian artist, running out on his arm. So you can see it's quite an interesting mix of very well-known sort of international artists and emerging performance pieces. These again are their audiences. As I say, we just get crowds. And this is right next door to the National Gallery, Victoria, in Melbourne. I can assure you, you can walk into the NGV and shoot a gun and you won't hit anybody. And these places were packed. So it's a very interesting thing. I mean, I hope it continues, but I do wonder. And I think those institutions are learning from the examples of groups like Experimenta. Here we go. So I'll just talk briefly about 4 of the commissioned artists we're working with now. Jess McNeil is one of them. She works in video largely, so she's interested in that intersection between painting, installation, video and photography, and she often takes as a subject matter kind of that dynamic of the human and environmental relationship. So she manipulates digital video footage from well-known spaces. I think this one, I can't remember where this was, but they're often things like Trafalgar Square and places that are sort of iconic architectural sites. And she manipulates it. And also sites where people physically gather. So she's quite interested in that. She's going to be doing a new work called Sparrow Walk, which will be something similar. I guess she'll be working with the site and then integrating people with it. So what she does, though, of course, is she removes the person. So you can sort of see that, can't you? But that's a human cut out there. So she takes the person out and replaces it. Another sort of form from that architectural space. Katie, there's another one of her. So this is, if this was a moving image, you would see these are shadows that kind of travel down the steps. And of course, this is, for any Australian, this is the steps of the Opera House. It's all engraved in our brains. And it's got this beautiful pattern work, but there's no human beings there. Katie Turnbull is a Melbourne-based artist, and she's working primarily in animation and interactive design. And this work is called Modern Vanitas, Utterly Meaningless, Everything is Meaningless. This is going to continue that interest in experimental animation and multi-user spaces. So she's going to actually build an architectural space, and she has what's like basically this a record player, and then she drops discs onto it, and then there's a viewing site, and then you can make up your own animation. It's quite interactive. Oh, 5 minutes. So it's quite a lovely piece. Now, Christopher Fulham, again, is a video artist. I'm actually going to just flip through these because I just want to again, it's taking video imagery from kind of well-known Australian sort of images and splicing it. And he's just about to take off around Australia to do a whole lot of filming with a red camera strapped to his back. Wade Marinowski is a media artist working in robotics, immersive and interactive installation, performance, music, video. And he's interested in that relationship between the viewer and the object. These were these sort of strange automatons that were in the last exhibition. Now what he's actually been commissioned to do a new work for us. And that will be sort of based, it's called the Akonchi Project, and it's kind of loosely based on a Vito Akonchi video work where he followed somebody as far as he could until he followed them no further. So what will happen is you'll go into a space and what seems like just an object will then recognise you. It'll use facial recognition to acknowledge that you're a human being, and then it will track you around the space and follow you around the space. I hope it works. Yeah. It's not so that you can see these kind of strange objects. Now this is Tim Devine. He's working on a piece called Newsleaks, and he's collaborated with his collaborative group, which is called Social Bits, and they're creating. It's a publication that spews out of here in a kind of ticker-tape form. So these will be placed throughout Melbourne, and what happens is you go up to them. To be honest with you, this work, I'm worried that actual technological advances will overtake this artwork. You go up to it and it gives you a ticker tape sort of printout of where you are, what's going on in the world, temperature. It'll use some sort of facial recognition issues to deal with the people that are walking past, how many people have been walking past. So it'll give you a kind of snapshot not only of where you are, but where you are in the world. I think I can be honest when I say I did have a problem with this because I wondered if this was going to be any different from my iPhone. And so we are just working with Tim Devine right now to see, where does, and this was one of these works that made me worry about technological advances overtaking an artist's investigation. Where does the artist come into this? Where do they make a difference? And maybe that'll get me to the end of my paper, which is really saying, anyway, there's a whole range of other artists, of course, we'll be working with, but what I want these artists to do, I guess, is to, as I say, address that central dilemma of how all these technologies that we're dependent on are they're not so new, but they're expected now. And what does it mean to consider or to reflect and to communicate with that fellow human being? What does that really mean for all these interfaces, these discussions about Japan, the kind of human condition that we all want to forget, and we just do want to go on with life? Artists are the ones that leave those remnants of reminders. They really investigate what we are as human beings. I mean, I suppose with robotics, what we are when we're not human beings too. And that's what I think I want to see, and that's what I think where our future lies probably in media arts, is really investigating the kind of the philosophical and psychological issues of being a human being, not just the technological basis, but we have to use technology now because that is the material we have around us. Thank you very much.